Every now and again, something happens to shake us out of our complacency. We see or interact with something that doesn't fit in the normality of modern life. It can shake us to the core, make us question many things that we had previously felt certain of. G'day, I'm Kitty. Welcome to Fairy Encounters. There is one question which presents itself in every single one of my videos. Are we alone? Well, here is a collection of 13 true sightings and encounters with high strangeness that show us, no, we're not alone. I was a young child when it happened, around 6 years old. My grandmother's old boss had let her stay at his cabin. It was either in far northern Minnesota or in Wisconsin somewhere, and she invited us to come and stay with her. I remember it was in a very secluded area, heavy woods and forest. After we got all settled in, my mum and grandma started making lunch, so they gave my brothers and I the okay to go and explore for a bit. And I remember watching my brothers run off in one direction, so I decided to go in the opposite direction. After a while of exploring, I came upon this really pretty river and small waterfall-esque area. After just staring at it for a while, I sat on the side of it and dipped my legs into the water and just started chucking tiny rocks into the water. Well, after a few minutes, I saw movement by the waterfall part of the river and saw there a pretty woman with long, damp white hair. Her skin seemed off-coloured, and her arms and legs had these weird frilly things on them, and she was also nude, but little me didn't really think twice about it, or really think it was odd. Once she noticed I had seen her, she slid into the water and disappeared, only for a few moments later to appear in the middle of the river closer to my side. And she just stared at me before letting out a melodic laugh and then started singing. I remember the whole forest going completely silent, and my entire attention was on her and the beautiful singing, this melodic sound coming from her. Before I knew it, I had walked into the water towards her, but due to being a kid and not being very good at swimming, the speed of the river left me struggling and panicking as I started to be pulled under. Not by the woman, but just by the movement and the speed of the water. I remember being completely underwater and struggling to get afloat. And then things going black. I woke up on the shore side of the water with her looking over me. She had a sad expression on her face, and then I heard my brothers shouting for me, which made her quickly hop in the water and disappear. I eventually stood up and ran to my brothers and tried telling them what had happened, but they didn't believe me and just thought that I'd hit my head and fallen into the river. But I know what I saw, what I heard, and what I felt, as I clearly remember her stroking my face and bringing me back to the shore after nearly drowning. Even to this day, my family makes fun of me and calls me the mermaid lover and stuff like that. But I know what I saw, and I truly believe it was some kind of water lady, be it a nymph or water spirit, but I think whatever the lady was, she had only meant to entertain and play with me, but then wound up saving my life. In my late teens, I used to work at a cave that was a tourist attraction. It was a very busy place. The tour guides always used to tell people all the different ways that people had died in the cave. But then in the late 90s, the script that they used was changed to make the tour more G-rated or family-friendly, I guess. So, needless to say, all of us employees still knew very well how many people had died there since the 1890s. So it was always one of those things that we used to joke about just among ourselves. Anyways, one evening, after closing, some of the older tour guides were messing around with a brand new tour guide, and they told her to go and sweep the cave. Now remember, this is a cave, so at the time, I thought that this was the practical joke, but nope. They told her to make sure she got right back in an area that was quite a ways back from the entrance. And once they saw she was back there, they started swinging the extremely large and thick bank vault-like door shut, and they managed to get it shut while she was still making a beeline for the door. They then turned off the cave lights from the outside. I told the guys to let her out quick and not to prolong the torture. We could all hear the faint screaming and frantic banging on the vault. But they didn't care. And then it suddenly stopped. They quickly rushed to get the door open and flip the lights on, but she wasn't anywhere to be seen. Then we found her tucked away behind a corner, quite a ways away from the entrance, and much farther than we thought she could have made it in the dark. She was sitting on the ground, rocking back and forth with her arms wrapped around her knees, hyperventilating. After we got her somewhat calmed down, all she said was, "Someone grabbed me." She was never the same after that night. She was a bubbly, outgoing person before, and a quiet, standoffish person after. We could never get her to talk more about what happened, and she quit soon after. I wanted to add that I was not really part of the prank. I tried speaking up, but I was afraid that they'd do something to me as well. I'm not proud of it, but, bullying makes kids handle things not so well. I still think about it a lot, and often kick myself for not standing up more, but I have also tried to forgive myself. My granny was a real religious kind of woman, and she loved to try and scare me and my sister with stories of devils and demons and other evil things to make us be good and behave, but she always told this one story that just didn't fit the others. Funny thing is, I've never heard this story nowhere but from her, so thought it might do well to let others hear it. My granny used to swear up and down that there was some sort of devil or other nasty thing that could disguise itself as someone else. She said it wasn't too good at it though, and you could always tell something was off. Firstly, my granny said that whatever this thing was, it weren't human in the slightest. Wasn't some sort of witch or nothing, just something else entirely. She told me she didn't know what it really looked like neither, under that disguise and all. She told me that after her second husband died, about 2 weeks after the funeral, she got a knock at the door in the middle of the night in the dead of winter during a nasty snowstorm. She said she opened that door and there stood Hoyt, her second husband. She said at first she really thought it was him, but after he stepped into the light of the house, she knew something was off with him. She told me he looked sigogglin, which means built funny or crooked. I didn't know what that word meant back then though, so that sort of became the name of the thing. She said the first thing that was off about him were his eyes. They were just a touch too far apart. Not to any extreme degree, but just enough that it put her off. Then, she said, his skin was a hell of a lot smoother and less wrinkly than he was when he died. He was damn near 90, and she said he looked at least 10 years younger that night. She got real anxious-like when she started noticing all this stuff that didn't add up, and add to that the fact that she buried him 2 weeks before, and then she started panicking real hard. She said Hoyt reached up with both his hands and started telling her, "Don't worry, honey." But his voice wasn't right neither. She said it sounded like it hurt him to talk, like there was a groaning just behind his voice, and his lips didn't match up neither. She told my brother and me that it started to look more like someone put a bad mask of Hoyt and was wearing it around. She said she'd never been scared in her whole life. So she started pushing him and hitting on him with both her fists, and that woman was feisty as hell, so I'm sure she did some damage. And she said his skin was cold when his hands touched her. After she beat on him a little, the thing stepped back and started making noises she ain't ever heard before. She said it was like a low growl or a moan, and compared it to a heavy old door opening real slow-like. She'd always try and make the noise herself, but get all choked up. Anyhow, she shut the door on the thing, and she said it just stood there for about an hour before it walked back into the woods. Now, she lived about 20 miles from any town, and her neighbours were all snowed in like her, so she couldn't call for help. Said she was the scariest she'd ever been that night. And she told us that the thing ain't always the same person, but can switch around and use new disguises when it wants to. She said that that's the only time she ever seen it herself, but had heard stories from her own mother about it. Funny thing is, about a month before she died, I went to the gas station on the way home from work real late, and when I got inside, there was a guy at the counter just standing there, all stiff-like. The cashier kept asking him to move so he could help me, but the fella wouldn't budge. Finally, the guy turned to me and I got a good look at his face. His skin was all rubbery and fake-looking, and I couldn't even really tell which way his eyes were facing, since they almost looked like two marbles, all dry and not wet like a normal eyeball. After I paid for my gas, the guy followed me out without saying as much as a word. It made me real uncomfortable, but at first I thought it was just someone who was down on their luck, So when I climbed back in my truck, I looked over to him and asked him if he needed help. He looked at me with those dry-looking eyes and said, "All good," with that same creaky voice my granny used to tell us about. Told her that story in the hospital the very next night, and she put her finger on my forehead and said, "Now you've seen it too." And I feel real strange about it. Maybe that guy at the gas station was the sigogglin, like my granny said, but who knows? About 50 years ago, 2 men from Ballywilly were returning home from morning mass on a Sunday, and they walked up to the hill to take a look at their sheep. When they were going around Craig Nave, they saw a house which they knew was never there before. The men stood for a while, wondering what to do. They knew well enough what their eyes were seeing, but knew too that all was not as it should be. Eventually they decided to take a look and approached the strange house. The 2 men entered the door and saw, to their astonishment, an old woman sitting hunched at the fire. It was a scene they had witnessed countless times before: children playing on the ground and a young woman making dinner. The house looked to be an ordinary country house. The young woman spoke to them as any person would, telling them to sit at the fire and wait till her husband came. At that moment, the old woman turned her head and signalled to the men silently not to sit, but for them to go back out the door. This they did, and were not 3 yards from the door when they turned back around to find there was nothing to be seen. The house and all its occupants were gone. There was nothing but the green field they had known, or thought they had known, so well. Many later said that had they waited until the husband came, they would never have gotten out. It was a clear moonlight night, about midnight, when I left Laxey on foot. I was about 5 miles from Douglas when I heard the voices talking, and was suddenly conscious of being in the midst of an invisible throng. As this strange feeling came over me, I saw coming up the road 4 figures, as real to look upon as human beings, and of medium size, though I am certain they were not human. When these 4, who seemed to be connected with the invisible throng, came out of the Garwick Road into the main road, I passed into a by-road leading down to a very peaceful glen called Garwick Glen, and I still had the same feeling that invisible beings were with me, and this continued for a good mile. There was no fear or emotion or excitement, but perfect calm on my part. I followed the by-road, and when I began to mount a hill, there was a sudden and strange quietness, and a sense of isolation came over me, as though the joy and peace of my life had departed with the invisible throng. From different personal experiences like this one, I am firmly of the opinion and belief that the fairies exist. One cannot say that they are wholly physical or wholly spiritual, but the impression left upon my mind is that they are an absolutely real order of beings, not human. A man named McKenny and his family lived along Berlurgan Road. Well, one day the man and wife went to town, leaving the children to look after the house. All went well till evening, and there was no sign of their return. As darkness fell, the children became anxious, and after a time they heard the alarming noise of a pack of hounds approaching the house. Now there was a pane missing from the back window of the house, and the children were surprised and terrified to see a man grasp the side of the window and push his head in. The children watched as the man was seized from behind by several forms outside and dragged back. Still he tried to escape their clutches, and this time managed to get one of his shoulders in, but the pull from behind became greater, and he was again dragged out. This time he was surrounded and carried off roaring for all that was in his power. Next morning it was found that the man of the house was drowned in the Black Ford when returning from town, and it was commonly believed that he had been captured by the fairies and was trying to escape when the forms appeared at the window. It was thought that if any person were to have caught his arm, he probably would have escaped the fairies. About 2 miles from Burragboy, there lived 2 men, 2 brothers, by the name of Pat and Mike Geraghty. One ordinary night they were coming home as they had 100 times before, taking a shortcut across the fields. But when they stepped in over a stile that led from the road, a faint man appeared and walked in between the 2 of them. The men said nothing until they reached a ditch, as they were expecting that he would leave them there, but instead he jumped the ditch with them. When they came to the gate of their own house, the spectre disappeared. The brothers entered their home, and both of them fainted and fell onto the floor. To their family's grief, both men soon fell ill and died. It was at Llandaff, when I was on a visit to an old friend, that I saw and heard the Gwa Ribbon. I was sleeping in my bed and was woke at midnight by a frightful screeching and a shaking of my window. It was a loud and clear screech, and the shaking of my window was very plain, but it seemed to go by like the wind. I was not so much frightened as you may think. Excited I was, that's the word, excited, and I jumped out of bed and rushed to the window and flung it open. Then I saw the Gwa Ribbon, saw her plainly, a horrible old woman with long red hair and a face like chalk, and great teeth like tusks, looking back over her shoulder at me as she went through the air with a long black gown trailing along the ground below her arms. For her body I could make out none. She gave another unearthly screech while I looked at her. Then I heard her flapping her wings against the window of a house just below the one I was in, and then she vanished from my sight. But I kept on staring into the darkness, and then I saw her go in at the door of the Cow and Snuffers Inn, and then return no more. I stood watching the door of the inn for a long time, but she did not come out. The next day, and it's the honest truth I'm telling you, they told me the man who kept the Cow and Snuffers Inn was dead. He had died in the night. His name was Llewellyn. You can ask anyone about him. He had kept the inn there for 70 years, and his family before him for 300 years, just at that very spot. You know, it's not these new families that the Gwa Ribbon ever troubles. It's the families of the old stock. I was 24 at the time and living in Anglesey. One night I was walking home at about 10:30 at night when there appeared just before me a very pretty young lady of ordinary size. I felt no fear at her sudden appearance, but stepped toward her and said, "How do you do?" And I put out my hand to shake hers, but my hand and my arm went right through her form. I couldn't understand this and just stood there, baffled. I reached out a few more times to touch her, but with the same result. There was no solid substance in the body, yet it remained beside me and was as beautiful a young lady as I ever saw. When I reached the door of the house where I was to stop, she was still with me. Then I said good night to her. No response being made, I asked, "Why do you not speak?" And at this, she disappeared. One late evening, John McArdle was coming through Dowstown and he saw a young girl standing in the middle of a field crying. He called out to her to see if she was okay and asked what was wrong. She just began laughing. Well, he slid down into the field with the intention of seeing what was the matter, and when he came near to the girl, she started to run and he followed her around the field. Well, this chase continued another 3 times around the field. Just then, the tailor happened to be passing by, and he saw John running, but nothing or no one else. He called out, "John, what are you running for?" Immediately, John stood stock still, and in a moment he dropped to the ground in a faint. His friend tried to rouse him, and after many failed attempts, managed to bring John back to consciousness. Afterwards, John was to say that if not for the arrival of his friend, he would have continued chasing the strange girl until his death. One night I was out for a walk and a super thick fog hit. It was fun at first. I couldn't even see the end of the light cone from my headlamp and barely saw one foot in front of the other, walking my familiar path. Usually on this walk, I'd hear the sounds of the highway close by, since it's very busy all day and night, but at some point I noticed I didn't hear it anymore. As a matter of fact, I didn't hear anything but myself. There wasn't even wind anymore, and I was in an open field. There were no trees to obstruct the wind, and there's usually always some. It felt strange, but I knew this area really well, so I just decided to stay on my path and keep walking. Well, after a while, I heard a sharp whistling. That in itself isn't too weird because people walk their dogs a lot in those fields, and it was quite far away. But the whistling continued to sound through the night, and it seemed to get louder and closer. It was somewhat melodic after a while, more like a song than someone trying to catch the attention of a dog or a person. But the really weird part was that it came from the direction of the open and very muddy fields, and it was getting closer and closer to me. A person could walk in those muddy fields, but they'd make plenty of noise and probably lose a shoe or two trying to wade through that mess. I tried to just ignore it, but it was creeping me the hell out. But I kept on walking, slowly getting colder and colder, despite walking uphill and faster than I usually do. The whistling kept up, and out of the corner of my eye, I could sometimes make out a silhouette illuminated by my bobbing headlamp. And that's when I started to really freak out. I live in Germany, and we have a tale around here of the fog whistlers. There have been some historic accounts of them, with one of the major ones happening during the 30-Year War, when a small village close by Dusseldorf in 1622 was surrounded by a heavy fog overnight. Whistling was heard all around throughout the night, and on the next day, more than a dozen people were missing, never to be found. It's said that whistlers try to lure unsuspecting victims closer, but that if you can whistle their favourite tune, you might survive. If not, they'll devour you. They'll stay right at the edge of how far you can see into the fog and never come any closer. They also only really stalk people who are out and about alone. Remembering that freaked me the hell right out, and I basically ran home. These days, when fog hits, I turn on my heel and head back home to work out another day. I'm not great enough of a fool to meddle with stuff like that. Long ago, there was a castle in Howth where a ship was wrecked on the rocks nearby. The Earl of Howth gathered everyone he could find, and together they saved as many people as they could from this shipwreck. The next morning, there was a strange lady sailing on a raft near the shipwreck, and the Earl of Howth went out and saved her himself. She stayed about 6 months, and no one knew anything about her. Or when at last she was leaving the house, she placed a black band around the wrist of the Earl of Howth. Soon after, he was married, and his wife was very curious to know about this black band on his wrist. One night, when he was asleep, she went to look at this black band with a candle, but in her recklessness, the band caught fire and was burned. The next morning, there was a rat at the end of the bed, and for the longest time, everywhere the Earl went, the rat followed him. Eventually, his dismayed brother brought him away to the continent in an attempt to rid themselves of the rat. But when they arrived, the rat was there before them. The brother, in his rage, killed the rat, and when he turned and looked at the Earl, he was dead. About 6 years ago, a man named Michael Ryan was visiting a house called Kilmanton's. He was a regular visitor there himself, but that night he had a friend with him named Sean O'Sullivan. They stayed playing cards at Kilmanton's all night until about 2 in the morning. It happened when they were walking back to Michael's home. They came to a place where it was known that a ghostly spectre was sometimes seen to lay across the road. The place on the road it lay was recognised by a gnarled hawthorn tree which stood behind a broken stone wall. As they approached, Sean saw the spectre outstretched on the road, but feeling fearful of what it might do, he said nothing and just walked around it. Michael, though, showed no reaction at all to the sight of the man on the road, and not only continued to walk right toward him, he actually stepped on his legs as he walked along the road with no reaction. When they reached Michael's house, Sean said to him, "Didn't you see him laid out on the road?" Michael told him he hadn't seen him at all, but that he had been feeling strange since walking that part of the road. When they got inside the house, Michael went to bed, and there he stayed for a year to the day. Unable to rouse himself to his feet, he was cared for by family, but slowly wasting away. After the year had passed and Michael regained himself, he fled to America for fear he would cross that ghost again. If there's one thing these encounters tell us, it's that there are things out there in the darkness and sometimes in the light which observe us and occasionally, for reasons of their own, step out and make contact. Would you enjoy a sneak peek of every new video? Perhaps you'd like audio versions of my videos to listen to at your leisure, or enjoy exclusive posts from me and have your name on every video. Wowzers! You can just join me as a patron. It's easy and safe to join. Just check out the link to Patreon in the notes below. I would love your support. Until next time, stay curious. Cheerio!